Hi, this is the review video for 7D, graphing sine and cosine functions. Our success criteria for 7D had 3 parts to it. We need to use the coordinates of the unit circle to sketch a graph of the sine and cosine functions. We need to be able to identify the midline and the amplitude of our trigonometric functions both as graphs or as equations. And we need to be able to find the period of a trigonometric graph or equation. So the first thing I want to remind you of again is our friend, the unit circle, and the fact that when we start over here to the right, that this first point 0 is at 1, 0, and our second point at the top is at 0, 1. Then we're over to the left, we have negative 1, 0, and at the bottom we have 0, negative 1. And we need to remember that the first coordinate is always the cosine of theta, and the second one is the sine of theta. So we'll use our x values when we're graphing our cosine function, and we'll use our y values when we're graphing our sine function. And as you rotate around this circle multiple times, that gets you multiple repetitions of the wave. So in lesson 9, we talked about these points. So this is just taking exactly what I had on the previous slide. I'm at 0, 0. So then at pi, or over 2, or at 90 degrees, we're at 1, because you're straight up. Then at 180 degrees, that would be straight to the left, would be back to 0 for our y value. So this is the y value. So when I graph that, I'm going to start with 0, 0 for our sine wave. Then at pi over 2, we're going to put a dot at 1. Then back to 0. Then down to negative 1, then back up to 0. And we can continue that pattern where we oscillate between the minimum and the midline and the maximum and back to the midline. And there is our sine wave. Sine waves, remember, always go through the midline on the y-axis. And this is the parent function, so it hasn't been translated up and down, so it's going through the origin at 0, 0 to start with. Here's one that's pretty Desmos designed. They went by a half, but here's your pretty graph, all the same thing. Cosine. Cosine function, when it's in its parent form, remember, is dealing with the x values. So when we're to the right, think about your unit circle. When we're over here to the right, we're at 1. When we're up at 90 degrees, we're at 0. When we're over here at 180 or pi, we're at negative 1. So for my cosine graph, I start at 1, and then I go to 0, then to negative 1 at 180 or pi, and back to 0, and back to the max. So one full cosine wave would look like that. And then you continue your pattern to the left. Okay. So here we are again. Your quiz may have a cosine graph with a different amplitude or a sine graph with a different amplitude, and we'll talk more about that here in a later slide, but this is your basic parent function for sine and cosine. And you do need to be able to graph that to click off that first success criteria. Okay, so if you remember the success criteria, it said, given a graph, be able to identify your midline, amplitude, and period. So looking at this graph, I should be able to find my midline. And to find my midline, I'm going to look at my max versus my min. And so my minimum is at -6, my maximum is at 2. That's 8 units apart. So if I go up 4 units, right there should be my midline. Well, that's at -2. So we would write the midline is y equals -2. To find my amplitude, it's the distance from the top to the midline or from the midline to the min. Both of those are going to be the same. So, because remember the midline was halfway, 1, 2, 3, 4. So my amplitude would be 4. My period for this function, I would follow the wave. So if I take my highlighter and I start on the y-axis and I follow the wave until I get back to where I started from. So I have to do both a min and a max, and I come back to where I started from. So I started on the midline, I ended on the midline. I've got both my max and my min on here. So how far in the x direction did I travel? So how far across here? Well, to that point right there. So that means my period would be 2 pi. Okay? Just to make sure that I've talked about everything that's possibly going to be asked of you, I would have to know that this is a sine wave. So this is a sine function. SIN is our abbreviation, but it is a sine graph because it starts at the midline. Looking at the second graph I have over here, here is my y-axis because there's 0 right there. So this one is starting at its maximum. There's a minimum. That's at 1. The maximum is at 7. That's 6 units apart, so that means 1, 2, 3 units up should be my midline. That was a little crooked, but okay. So my midline would be at y equals 4. Y equals 4. 4. It's halfway between my maximum and my minimum. The distance up, we said, was 3. That's also the distance down. That would be my amplitude. So my amplitude is 3. My period on this one, again, I'll get my highlighter out. We start at a max. We're going down the wave to our min, and then we should end on a max. So we end on a max right there, and we go down and look at the x-axis at that point, and that happens to be pi. So that means our period is pi. Since it started at a max, this is a cosine graph. This would be cosine. Okay? So you have to be able to, from a graph, be able to identify the midline, the amplitude, and the period. Okay, the last thing we need to make sure we can do is from an equation identify all those things. So just thinking about this equation, I have to realize that this number out in front, the 3, that's my amplitude. The 4 is going to affect my period. And remember, the formula for period is always 2 pi divided by 4, or b in this case. Whoops. Formula is 2 pi divided by b. So in this case, b is 4. Well, that reduces 2/4 reduces to 1/2, so that would be pi over 2. We don't do frequency this year, so we won't worry about that. Our midline is always affected by the number that's added and subtracted because that's a vertical shift. So my midline would be at y equals -1. So from the equation, I know my amplitude is 3, my midline is -1, and I can find my period by taking 2 pi divided by b. And why is it 2 pi? Because the full trip around the circle is 2 pi. That's our circumference. Okay, so this is a cosine graph. I'm going to start by putting in my midline at -1. That was an oops. So we'll get rid of my little oops. -1 would be below the x-axis at -1. My amplitude is 3, so I usually go over here to the side and go 1, 2, 3, so I know where my maxes are going to be, and 1, 2, 3, so I can find my minimums. So my tops and my bottoms of my curve. So 3 above and 3 below. My x scale. Now, if the graph's already scaled, then that's one thing, but if you get to scale your graph, make 4 hash marks, 1, 2, 3, 4, representing the 4 quadrants, and make that 4th hash mark be your period. So this would be pi over 2, and halfway, half of pi over 2 is pi over 4, and then we'd make 4 hash marks to the left. And this would be negative pi over 2 and negative pi over 4. Okay, so I use my period on my fourth hash mark when I get to make the scale. Cosine graphs start at their max when they're positive, and this one is a positive cosine, so we're going to go up 1, 2, 3 from the midline and put our first dot. Then at our next hash mark, we'll be on the midline. Then at the next hash mark, we're 1, 2, 3 below. Then back to the midline. Then we end on our max. So that would be 1 period, whoops, almost missed that, of my cosine graph. I can continue my pattern on and cover the whole graph. Whoa, that's a little crooked. And over here, I'd be back to the midline and down to the min and back to the midline and finally up here at the max. So at the period, you should end on the same place that you started. So if you started a max at pi over 2, the period for this function, you should end at that max. Okay, I think I have time to do one more. So here's that formula. Period is 2 pi over b. We don't worry about frequency this year, so I'll get rid of that. Our midline is always that d value, the value that's on the back end, and the amplitude is always the positive number out in front. Okay, it's always the absolute value of that front. So for this function, I would have 4 for my amplitude, 1 for my vertical shift, so my midline would be at y equals 1, and my period, I'm going to write that over here. You're going to take 2 pi and divide it by 1/2. Now we like to call this Kentucky chicken fried because you have to keep the top of the fraction. So this is going to be equal to 2 pi. You change the division to multiplication and you flip the 1/2. So you make that 2 over 1. Kentucky chicken fried. I keep the top, I change to multiplication, and I flip the bottom. So that will give me a period of 4 pi. So if you have a choice, you're going to do 1, 2, 3, 4 hash marks, and that's where we're going to put 4 pi. So our period would be 4 pi. 1, 2, 3, 4 hash marks, we put a negative 4 pi. Halfway would be 2 pi. Okay. Midline this time is at positive 1. So I put my line across there at positive 1. My amplitude is 4, so 1, 2, 3, 4 to the top. 1, 2, 3, 4 to the bottom. So that tells me that my max, my top of my peak should be up here, my bottom of my peak should be down there. Sine wave starts on the y-axis at the midline. So midline max, midline min, midline max, midline. So notice when I did one full period, 4 pi, I ended at the midline where I started. Then I can continue this pattern on to cover the rest of my graph. And I need to see those dots made when you make your graph. You can continue that pattern over there. Okay? I hope this helped you with Target 7D. Good luck on your quiz.